Hello everyone. Last week I started our look at one of Ireland's most famous citizens, Seamus Heaney. Specifically, we looked at his childhood. Well, childhood doesn't last forever, so now we turn to the period in his life after he graduates from Queen's University, Belfast. In 1961, Seamus is a 22-year-old graduate of English and Literature, ready to face the world. Well, instead of actually immediately facing the world, he decides to go to St. Joseph's College of Education to get a degree in teaching, which takes a year to complete. His first job is at St. Thomas's Secondary Intermediate School. The school is based in the townsland of Ballymurphy in Belfast. Because it was a predominantly Catholic area, it would become, in a few short years, a major flashpoint. Anyhow, he teaches in Ballymurphy until 1965, and it's a time where he's not just teaching, but learning. The headmaster of St. Thomas's is Michael McClaverty, author of books like Call My Brother Back and Lost Fields. McClaverty notices both the fire and the raw talent burning in Heaney, and guides him to other key Irish poets, most notably Patrick Kavanagh, who, spoiler alert, I will be doing as part of this series later. As we had mentioned in the last episode, in university, Heaney has mostly read poets like Keats and other aristocratic Englishmen. He had discovered one rural English poet, but now, with Kavanagh, Heaney is introduced to poets who grew up in the same structures and lands as himself. And Kavanagh isn't writing about Celtic mythology or other fanciful things, but rather gritty, mud-spattered agricultural and rural realities that the young Seamus Heaney can absolutely, fully relate to. Seamus absolutely loves this. Kavanagh, as introduced by Headmaster McClaverty, provides Heaney with the key to unlocking his own memories of childhood and real-world experience in both rural and urban Northern Ireland. The floodgates can now be opened and poured onto the page. But that's not all. If you know anything about the 60s, you'll know that young arty types, musicians, writers and that sort of thing, are starting to realise that there is strength in numbers. Philip Hobsbawm, that's some name, isn't it, was an English writer and academic. In England, he had created a group which he called The Group. Genius name. However, in 1963, he gets a job lecturing in Queen's, Belfast, and here he sets up another group. Again, it has a brilliantly imaginative name. That's sarcasm, by the way. The Belfast Group. The meetings of the group are all the same format, starting with the discussion of a single poet's work, and after a break for coffee and biscuits, there is an open session in which participants could read any work they wished. The group met once a week, initially on Tuesday evenings and later on Monday evenings. During Philip's work year, as he was a lecturer, the meetings would be at number 4 Fitzwilliam Street, his family home near the university. Seamus Heaney attends group meetings from the very start, and he ends up taking 7 poems that would make it into his 1965 collection called 11 Poems, from his group sheets for the group. Now, the group may sound something like a passive little book club. It definitely is not. Each time a poet reads some of their work, the other poets are encouraged to critique as strongly as possible each other's work. This is done in the hope that a no-holds-barred approach will spur the members on to become better poets. To say it seems to have worked for Seamus is an understatement. Although his first collection, the 11 Poems, is published in 1965, it's actually not the biggest thing to happen that year, because, somewhat in the background, young Seamus has been navigating the streams of young love. After meeting in St. Joseph's in 1962, Heaney realises that Marie Devlin is not just a teacher, but they also share a passion and ability for writing. In 1965, they get married. Now, I mentioned in the last episode about the Troubles. Well, Marie's family gives us a fascinating insight into the realities of Belfast. Her mother was of Protestant Huguenot or Huguenot roots. If you don't know, Huguenots are French people from the 15 and 1600s who flee religious persecution in France, and many of them end up in Ireland. Her father is himself of mixed background, with both Presbyterian and Catholic ancestors. For Heaney, as a Catholic, to have a girlfriend and then wife with such a background gives him a lot of thought, and an eye-opening insight to life that many would not have had at a time when Northern Ireland, and Belfast particularly, is a deeply segregated community along sectarian lines. I'm sure you know the phrase, behind every good man is a good woman. Well, in the case of Seamus Heaney, he really does have Marie as a rock on which to stand, and it's just as well because his star is about to shoot. The year after they get married, in 1965, so 1966, Seamus becomes lecturer at Queen's. His son Michael is born, and, most importantly, from a poetry point of view, Death of a Naturalist, his collection, is released. Faber and Faber, home to writers like W.H. Auden and Sylvia Plath, are his publishers. This is not just an ordinary book. For a 27-year-old from rural Northern Ireland, this is a massive endorsement of the talent of Seamus Heaney. Death of a Naturalist repays him in full, winning 2 massive literary prizes at the first attempt. Now, why don't we take a look at a poem from that collection that has probably become one of Seamus's most famous? Digging. Seamus, in the poem, is sitting at his desk, trying to write, when he hears his father digging in the bog. He opens with, "Between my finger and my thumb, the pen rests, snug as a gun," and closes, after Seamus has realised he's not a man who will follow his forefathers into physical work for life, with, "Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it." Heaney knows he's breaking the chain, as I've said, of physical labour, stretching back generations. He had heard in his university days of a Polish poet who claimed a poem needed a biological reason to exist. This story of him breaking from family tradition is reason enough, or so he thinks. Some people also think that the gun metaphor for the poem is also an indication he could see the beginnings of what would become euphemistically called the Troubles. In fact, throughout many of Heaney's poems, there is a violent undertone. Frogs forming a mob, berries rotting, things like that. Poets are often seen as seismographs, being able to see cultural shifts long before others, and this is exactly what Seamus seems to be doing. In 1968, Heaney is taking part in a civil rights march in Derry, a thing that has become commonplace by that point, and he witnesses, for the first time, and first-hand, the full extent of police brutality. His response is to write to the Listener magazine, based in London, where he metaphorically opens fire on the brutality he has witnessed. By the early 70s, he's had enough, and takes 1970 and 71 as a visiting professor to UC Berkeley in California. He went from one melting pot of culture and political strife to another. Berkeley is the home in the 70s of radicalism. Everything from the anti-war movement to the Black Panthers to the free speech movement proudly and freely walk the streets. And of course, this is another perfect environment for poets. In the US, Gary Snyder and Robert Bly are to the forefront of the literary protests against the Vietnam War. Unsurprisingly, meeting such men as these sharpens Heaney's senses both of justice but also responsibility. He feels compelled to give the same voice to the conflict in his home of Derry as Blythe and Snyder were giving the Vietnam War. After he returns from Berkeley, Seamus realises it has all become too much. He feels he must escape the volatile city of Belfast. So he resigns his lectureship and escapes to the lush, rolling fields of Glanmore Cottage, County Wicklow, in the Republic. Both physically and psychologically removing himself from the conflict zone allows Heaney to write freely exactly what he thinks of the violence. He produces another of his startling metaphor-rich poems, personifying his thoughts as an Iron Age bog body. He does this after reading a book called Bog People, about Danish instances of human bodies preserved in bogs, full of startling images of Iron Age bodies found in the province of Jutland. If you're not aware, bog bodies are not just skeletons. These specific conditions found in bogs allow for everything from skin to teeth and even hair colour to be preserved intact from thousands of years ago. There are quite a few in Ireland, so that again is something I can definitely do a series on in this podcast. Seeing this, Seamus almost subconsciously immediately sees in the face of a murder victim from Bronze Age Denmark the faces of murder victims from 1970s Belfast. In short, Seamus Heaney almost, you could say, uses the bog bodies as a deep freeze of history, where the geographic and temporal distance of Bronze Age Jutland allows him to make allusions to modern-day Belfast that would be too cutting to make directly. Heaney finds so much inspiration in it, he publishes two works, Wintering in 1972 and North, another smash hit in 1975. In both, he imagines the bog bodies as a precursor and, in some cases, a patron saint of the victims of the Troubles. Internationally, both works are massively popular and widely praised. In Ireland, however, he is almost destroyed for it. Politician Conor Cruise O'Brien accuses Heaney of being an apologist for violence. By comparing sectarian murder to ancient rituals, the claim is that Heaney is mythologizing conflict. That conflict was natural and unavoidable. Cruise O'Brien feels Seamus Heaney should be, instead, calling it out as a shocking, repulsive campaign of inexcusable violence. In the poem Punishment, for example, he writes about the body of a preserved young woman who, it is believed in the 70s anyway, to be an adulteress punished by her tribe, shaven-headed and blindfolded. Heaney explicitly connects this to a similar and oftentimes worse fate doled out to the women in his homeland who are accused of relations with the enemy. Seamus says how, in the case of the Iron Age woman, he would have thrown the stones of silence and admits that this is almost the same as what he is doing in relation to the Troubles. While his sisters, for example, are outraged, he is silent. He explores the profound reality of guilt and silence and tribal loyalty. He admits in another poem that he wants to be an inner emigre, a phrase that will become synonymous with him. By this, he means he wishes to escape to a place internally where he does not have to write or even think about the horrifying reality of the world. Heaney later recounts a story of being on a train in 1979 where he ran into Sinn Féin activist Danny Morrison. Sinn Féin are the political wing at the time of the Republican movement, and Danny asks Seamus straight out, "When are you going to write something for us?" Not something neutral, but a direct demand for propaganda. If you would like to see what Heaney thinks of this encounter, may I suggest reading his poem Flight Path, which is about this very moment. Funny enough, Heaney is thinking of dedicating a translation he is working on to the political prisoners at the time, on the Republican side, but the tone of this encounter with Morrison completely throws him off the idea. But it wasn't in sympathy to the British. In 1983, Heaney writes a pamphlet objecting to his inclusion in a collection of British poetry which had recently been published, saying, "My passport's green, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen." All the while, once he had moved to Wicklow, he goes over the county boundary to Dublin to resume his teaching career. In 1976, he moves from Wicklow to Sandymount, purely for ease of travel to work. He will never move house again. He publishes a collection in 1979, much more light-hearted than previous efforts. Then, as the clock ticks into the 1980s, Seamus Heaney's star, which had been rising, was about to shine brightly on the world stage. Thanks for listening. But just before my outro, just a note that if you look up Substack, search for the History and Heritage podcast, you may just find me there. Anyhow, like this if you can, tell me what you did and didn't like, follow me on Instagram at Liam Blake Podcaster, and, most importantly, tell everyone about the History and Heritage podcast. Bye!